Good evening to, and my screen just blanked out, to the October 9th regular meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission. So we have 3 agenda items tonight. The first one is public comment, and I just looking out, it does not look, do we have anybody from the public that would like to come and speak? No, that was my guess. I just wanted to verify. So I'm not sure if we want to go to item C just while there's some technical kind of
Sure, that's a great
organization.
Let's do it.
Okay. So items from commission and staff. Let's start with staff, unless you want me to start with commission.
Go ahead.
Okay. Anything from commission in terms of any updates? Yeah, Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I'm going to be gone visiting my daughter this week, later on this week, but there's a historic review board meeting at 8:30 that I normally would attend. So if another board member would be interested in attending, it's 8:30, and I believe it's in here, but it's on the website, you know.
And what, sorry, Commissioner Baker, what night and what time?
It's Friday morning at 8:30 in the morning.
Okay. So if any,
What date? This Friday.
This Friday. That's why I can't make it, because I'm not going to be here.
okay. If any commissioners can make that, maybe they can email Commissioner Baker. Does that work, or would you prefer
But
showing up?
just show up.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it. And just tell them you're the planning commission representative.
Okay, great. And any other commissioners? Yes.
Yeah, I have an
Regula.
update on the River Road Santa Clara neighborhood plan, and the working group updated their draft goals. And so they're on the working group website, and so those have pretty much been finalized, and now they're starting to work on policies that they want to submit with the goals. So that working group is moving forward at a pretty good pace, and it's exciting to see the progress that they're making.
Great, great. Commissioner Borofsky, did you have your hand up?
Go ahead, Tiff.
Okay.
I have been attending several different work groups and such. Let's see, so the ETAC, the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee, has met. They had their first meeting last week. We will have a second meeting this week. And we're really just kind of starting that work. I'm one of the 2 planning commissioners that is sitting in on those. The housing tools and strategies work that's being done through the city, there's a total of 4 meetings. They've had 2, and we're kind of moving along with that process. It's a community, the facilitated community process to identify barriers to housing affordability and diversity and availability in Eugene. And hopefully we'll have some outcomes that we'll be able to, they'll be moving forward and with recommendations to the appropriate governing entities, likely City Council. And then the, clear and objective housing standards was a meeting that I wasn't able to attend, so I guess I don't have an update for that one, sorry. That's it.
I saw another hand over there. Yeah, Commissioner.
Well, I was just going to give a little bit of an update on the clear and objective standards meeting that was last night. You know, Commissioners Baker and Taylor and I were there and had table discussion and talked about various issues that are currently in the code that are not clear and objective, and kind of brainstormed some ideas on what might be ways to correct those. And just a wide variety of people. This was the second, I believe, of 4 meetings. I wasn't able to come to the first one, but this was the second one. There'll be another one next Tuesday, I believe, and then the following Tuesday as well.
Great. Commissioner Baker.
I was going to add that turnout was much, much lower than the first meeting, and I have a feeling it was scheduled on a holiday. Right? And a lot of people get that day off, and that may be a problem. Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, depending on whatever. Post office is closed, banks are closed, you know. So that may have contributed to it. But the first workshop, the issues were very complicated, and they had a shortage of background material, and that may have contributed to it. So I thought the issues this time were more, they weren't obvious because you could have different positions on it, but the issues were more straightforward in that you didn't need to read a huge amount of background material to understand the challenge.
Commissioner Borowski?
Yeah, so luckily I was gone for the first half of the month, last month, so that was awesome. Missing 2.5 planning commission meetings was okay. But the ETAC meeting that Commissioner Edwards talked about, the main focus of that, the first end of this is going to be the urban reserves, is what our main thrust is going to be, to try and get that landed and then go into the growth monitoring after that. I think it's a good group, a good representation of our community, and some really smart people at the table. So I think that'll be a interesting committee to sit on. That's about it.
And Robin, so we've all, just for the benefit of the community, various subcommittees that the Planning Commission is a liaison for the committees. There's opportunity for public input in all of these realms that you can access on the city's website.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a ton of information on the website, always there 24/7.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful.
And if I could just add, I think most of those meetings are actually being recorded as well. So if you really have some time on your hands and you want to go back and watch them, they are there.
Perfect, thank you
city's
for adding
website.
that.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah. So it's that encouragement that if you have time, please get involved and get informed. and
Yeah, the
provide
project.
feedback.
That's right. The project timelines, they do move forward. All the dates for all the meetings are published and they're out there. In addition, I think for some projects, for example, the clear and objective approval criteria update, staff have also made office hours available where anybody who feels like I don't get it or this is too much or I don't have enough time, they've been trying to set aside hours during the day, different times of the day for folks to be able to stop by. Anybody, anytime can call staff and ask questions and talk to them. We strongly encourage that. We want everybody to have the information they need to participate. And at the same time, we also want to reinforce that you don't have to be an expert to participate. You can participate at whatever level with whatever knowledge you have in terms of what you want to see in your community, what you don't want to see in your community. And yeah, it's just important to get engaged if you have the time and the interest.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So it's all, yes, Commissioner?
Isn't there also a big open house tomorrow night at the library?
Yeah, correct. So are we segueing into items from staff?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Perfect. That was your prompt right
Okay,
there.
all right.
I didn't talk to her beforehand, she's brilliant.
Yeah, so tomorrow night, actually tomorrow evening from 4 to 7 p.m. In the Bascom-Tykeson room at the library, I believe, is going to be what we're calling the Planning Fair, also known as Planning Palooza. It's there is so much happening right now that I completely understand that as a community we have a certain bandwidth, right, to be able to engage in different processes. And I think the expectations are very high for what we as a community are able to accomplish in terms of our planning projects. So we're trying to meet that expectation at the same time, right? Limited bandwidth. So this is an effort to, for folks who may be wondering, what are these projects? How do they relate to one another? And how can I get information about them at the same time? As I mentioned earlier, every project has a wealth of information on the web available 24/7. This is a place where you can show up in person between 4 and 7 tomorrow evening at the library. Just drop in. Anybody who has an interest in any of the, I think there's maybe a dozen projects that are going to be represented there. And each project has a table, and there will be a staff person who can talk about the project, who can put people on an interested parties list, and also gather any feedback that people have at that time. So we're trying to make it sort of fun and interesting, which is always a challenge when you're talking about planning, right? But we're trying it anyway. So we'll see how that goes. It's experimental. And in response to folks in the community asking for more information about how projects relate to one another.
Great. Do you have anything else?
Yeah, so the other item, in fact, I think I'm going to wait until the end of Louise's presentation to go into the topic of the Planning Commission and City Council joint meeting, which is happening on October 24th. So,
Okay.
but I don't want to keep her waiting.
So can I, before we segue, okay, hold on one second. Before we segue, I just want to make sure, because last night, I think there were a lot of efforts on Planning Commissioner's behalf, and there were 5 of us that showed up for the Clear and Objective Standard meeting. So we don't have a quorum, 2 people left. So the actual people that are designated Planning Commission on kind of this liaison remained. So for tomorrow's, the Planning Palooza, show of hands who was thinking about going, just so we make sure we don't have redundancy. Okay, it looks like there's 2, so.
Maybe.
Maybe, okay, so we've got 3, so know that, if somebody else is interested, maybe check in with Commissioner Borowski, if his maybe turns to a no.
And I'll be there early, so if somebody wanted to go later in the evening, that could probably work too.
And
I'll be
Commissioner-
later.
Okay, so great, so there's some staggering and some negotiating that could happen. Okay, and Commissioner Edwards, did you have something?
You know, and I apologize if this isn't probably appropriate time to mention this, but I do not believe I can attend the City Council joint Planning Commission meeting. So if there's any, I planned on watching it after the fact, but I have a commitment that I can't get out of, so.
Okay. So we'll just need an 8x10 glossy photograph of you to put at the,
Right.
at the table.
And we'll do a little
position.
video.
Okay.
It's a requirement. Yeah. To let you know what's
All right.
included.
Thanks for the heads
Okay.
up.
Thanks.
Great.
Okay, we'll go to agenda item B, and it's fair housing training and staff. Take it away.
Okay, thanks. Just before we move on, I just actually want to say thanks to you guys who are putting in all the effort to go to these events and to participate. That is super awesome. And at the meeting with City Council, which we'll talk about later on, I think that's something worth talking about and mentioning because it's a lot of time and volunteer effort. So thank you. So on to the main event for this evening. We have. Yeah, do you want to introduce? Sure. Why don't you introduce that to give us a little context? Yeah, microphone, please. Thank you.
Teresa Kennedy, and work with the City of Eugene in Community Development. And we have Louise here tonight. The city receives Community Development Block Grant funds annually, and the condition of us receiving those funds is that we will affirmatively further fair housing. And so the way that the city does that is we have a contract with Fair Housing Council of Oregon, and they provide multiple fair housing services to community members. This year, they'll be providing 6 fair housing trainings to different, to boards and commissions, to different housing consumers in the community, as well as service providers and professionals to help advocate for fair housing rights for their clients. And Fair Housing Council of Oregon also has a hotline that community members can call if they have questions about potential housing discrimination or housing discrimination, and they'll provide advocacy, information, and they'll help with investigations. And they also provide publications and other resources. So, so we're pleased to have Louise here. And any questions about that? Okay.
Careful getting up. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna move this over here. Do we want the lights down? Because you're not gonna be able to see otherwise. Is that okay, guys? Well, normally I stand up, but I'm gonna have to sit down so I can maneuver. So, my name is Louise Dix. I'm in the planning department with the city of Gresham for about 12 years in Medford and a couple years in Gresham. I'm not a planner, I'm a housing policy analyst, and I also managed and administered the community development block grant programs there. And then I moved into the Fair Housing Council, with the Fair Housing Council about 8 years ago now. So, and I travel all around the state meeting with planning commissions and training landlords and realtors and so on about fair housing law and advocates all over the state. So this is going to be interesting to reach this. Okay. All right, so we are a statewide nonprofit, and we've been around since 1990, and we do provide testimony in fair housing litigation or in housing policy discussions. So I'll go around the state, and if there looks like there's an issue, well, for example, in Coos Bay, I didn't go to that one, but there was an issue with a land use issue about putting together a drug and alcohol center, and there was the planning commission. Pretty much, it met all the clear and objective standards and everything, but then the neighborhood came in and said, we don't want this here, needles, bad people, so on. And so the planning commission turned it down. And so we came in and spoke on that and say, you know, really, this is discrimination and you can't really do this. And so they turned that around. So that's the kind of things that we'll go out and do. So fair housing, it's not fair housing, it's civil rights legislation. People think fair, what's fair? What's equitable? But it's the set of federal, state, and local civil rights laws that protect everyone based on their membership in protected class. Everyone in this room is a member of at least one protected class. And it protects you from individual and or systemic discrimination in all housing transactions, from buying a house to borrowing money, to insuring your home, to renting a home, or to being in a shelter, a domestic violence or homeless shelter. It also means the proactive elimination of segregation and promotion of equal opportunity access to housing. This has been in the legislation since its inception back in 1968, and it's been broadened with this affirmatively affirming fair housing rule since 2015. So there's a lot more enforcement of that now, and now it's being taken away again. It's under fire, and we'll talk about that later. So we're going to talk about the history so you guys understand where this all came from. This is the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, and so I feel like I can give you a little history in terms of why this came about. For us, we're, as you all know, a pretty white state. We've got about 13% African Americans in the country, and about 2% are in Oregon. And we have a lot of concentrations of people with the same race or national origin living in various neighborhoods and communities. The segregation that we have in Oregon is more income-based than racially based, but we're starting to see concentrations based on race and national origin also in some of the more urban areas. So we were the only state to exclude African Americans. 1844, 1849 Oregon Territory laws said that African Americans could not live in this state. They were not allowed to live in this state. And they were given 20 to 39 whips, stripes, if they were found, and actually physically removed to Washington or Idaho across the border. They were removed from Oregon. We were admitted into the United States of America in 1859, and that exclusion law was in our Constitution when we were admitted to be a state. It was actually in the Constitution at that point, and it was finally removed in 1927. It wasn't enforced up until all that time, but it was only removed in 1927 physically from our Constitution, our state Constitution. It's one of the main reasons we're so white. So African Americans, Chinese, and Japanese weren't allowed to own real estate pretty much up until the 1940s. We had the largest KKK per capita in the nation in the 1920s here in Oregon. And when we talk about the KKK, since there weren't a lot of African Americans and Native Americans were, a lot of Native Americans had been decimated from disease and wars at that time. There were Chinese and Japanese, but there weren't that many. They were here to mine and they were farming and so on. So who do you think that they were targeting? You have any ideas on who they would be? You got it. You're smart. Okay. Yeah, Catholics was the target here in the state of Oregon. In fact, it was it was a big deal. There were 58 active claverns, and I have photos of the Klan marching down the street in Grants Pass. You can't see the end of it. And it was the thing to do. If you were the mayor, the police chief, you were a member of the Klan. And it was, they really, if anyone ran for the school board or for any kind of office and they were Catholic, there was a cross burned on their lawn. And they actually even got a law passed to close down all the parochial schools. That was never implemented, but they did get it passed. So we had sundown laws in our state up until the mid-1960s, mostly in Southern Oregon. Many of them were unofficial. They weren't on the books, but people knew they had to stay out of town or didn't go there after dark. The Harlem Globetrotters, for example, would come to play, to entertain in Grants Pass, but they had to leave and go to Roseburg to stay the night. They weren't allowed to stay in Grants Pass. Roseburg had one of the first public accommodation hotels for African Americans in the state, Roseburg in Portland. So the sundown laws were around for a long time. And a lot of African Americans that I've talked to in Portland still will not stop in certain places on I-5. When they go down to California, they say they won't stop just because of that perception. So 1940s, we had, not after the World War II, institutionalized policies that really solidified more segregation in our state. The FHA appraisal standards, the VA loan policies, these all were really not geared to help African Americans or anyone of color. Transportation improvements, urban renewal, removal, and then the white flight to the suburbs, of course, in the 60s. I would recommend this book by Richard Rothstein. If you've not read it, it's called The Color of Law. Have you read that, Elliot? Oh, it's amazing. It talks about how the federal government has really institutionalized this because of these policies, like the FHA policies and so on. They would not lend to developments like Levittstown in New York if they would sell to African Americans. So a lot of this was really ingrained in our federal policies, and this book goes into that. It's really interesting, and it's really disturbing. So, let's see. Redlining, you know what that is? What's the process of rating neighborhoods for stability, using the fact of people of color as making the neighborhood unstable and not wanting to lend there. We still see this today in many parts of the state. In fact, there was just a case in Connecticut about this, and not the state, the country. Racial covenants, this prevented owners of real estate to sell to African Americans or other racial minorities or Catholics. It would stay right in the deeds of trust, the title, you can't sell your home to an African American, you can't sell your home to a Catholic, and so on. It was declared unenforceable in Shelley versus Kramer in 1948, but we still see it. In fact, it was our state legislature last year had a piece of legislation that was to try to remove those from deeds of trust. You might remember that. It was to make it easier because it's a very difficult thing to remove those. They're not enforceable, but they're still in there. And there were two points of view. Some people thought we should keep it in there because it shows what our history is and the fact that it was all this racism and so on. But other people said, no, we want it out of there. So they did make it a little easier to move it out of there. So, and of course, in Eugene, you had African Americans that were denied housing within the city limits. We had a restrictive covenant from the River Road area. In the 30s and 40s, under the Ferry Street Bridge, historically it was a transient camp. And I guess there was a construction project in 1948 which displaced a lot of people. So, you guys remember those things? Heard about those things? Okay, so the Fair Housing Act was actually enacted in 1968. It was a week after the death of Dr. Martin Luther King. It really took his assassination to move it forward. It was the hardest piece of civil rights legislation to pass because it had to do with property rights. And so it was a very difficult one, and it really took his death and the riots that followed to kind of give them the impetus to pass it. And it was a bipartisan effort to pass it, signed into law by Lyndon Johnson. And HUD was named to enforce it, and there were penalties for violations, but they weren't really enforceable at that time. And like I said before, affirmatively furthering fair housing was included at that point. There wasn't a lot of teeth in it, but it was put in the original law. So the Fair Housing Act was amended in 1988 to add a couple different protective classes. First, there were only 4, and they added disability and familial status and made more effective enforcement measures. So here are your federal protected classes: race, color, national origin, and religion. Those were the original ones that were with the Fair Housing Act as it was passed in 1968. And gender was added in the 70s with the women's rights movement. Familial status, families with children under the age of 18, and disability, those were added, like I said, in 1988. And what was going on then with familial status is, many of you might remember want ads in the paper, classified ads that in the 70s and early 80s that would say no children, no pets. It was very difficult for families with children to find rental housing. No one wanted kids in the housing. So they were able to get that put in as a protected class. At the same time, the independent living movement was a very strong movement at the time, and there were institutionalized institutions, basically, state institutions that were closing down throughout the country, and people with disabilities were being put into the community, let into the community, but with finding, again, difficulties finding housing. So the independent living movement pushed and pushed for disability to become a protected class as well. We also have our own Fair Housing Act here in Oregon. It was actually passed in 1959 before the federal one. And besides the other protected classes, it includes marital status, whether you're single, married, or divorced, where your money comes from legally, your source of income, and that, of course, now includes the Section 8 or housing choice vouchers. Sexual orientation and gender identity are protected, and it's also federally funded housing nationwide, it's protected. And local ordinance, like here in Eugene, occupation and age are protected. Teresa, are there any other ones here in Eugene? Ethnicity, okay. So the protections continue to expand. When communities see that there's an area that maybe is needing help, then they will push to include that. And if a community like Eugene decides to have a protected class, then they are responsible for enforcing it. The federal protected classes are enforced through HUD and the Department of Justice, and the state ones are enforced through the Bureau of Labor and Industries. Domestic violence survivors are protected under the Oregon landlord-tenant law, and it's a very, very strong protection in our state, and it makes it very much more difficult to evict or refuse to rent to people that have been survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. I think we have one of the strongest protections in the country there. But if there was a case, it would probably be handled under gender, because the predominant number, mostly it's women that have problems with this. So it's really covered mostly under gender, but it is protected under the Landlord-Tenant Act. So there's actually 2 types of discrimination, and disparate treatment is the one that we mostly think about when we think about discrimination. It's where people are treated differently in the same situations based on their protected class. They're treated differently than someone else if somebody of color is being treated differently than somebody that's white, and somebody of different religion being treated differently. It's intentional, and to date, most cases are based on this disparate treatment. Disparate impact is the other one, and this is where a practice that results in a disparate impact on a group of persons or creates, increases, reinforces, or perpetuates segregated housing patterns because of race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, or national origin. Basically, it's when a facially neutral policy, when it's put into practice, has a greater impact, discriminatory impact on one group. And it could be well-intentioned, it could not, like I said, it's neutral. But when it's put into practice, it's definitely discriminatory. So this was the law of the land in 40 higher courts and then the Supreme Court made it more of the law of the land in a 5-4 ruling in 2015. So disparate impact is now, it's a way that we can handle fair housing issues. The case that's decided this was Texas Department of Housing, and they're like our Oregon Housing and Community Services. What they were doing is locating low-income housing tax credit projects in Dallas, Texas, in already segregated areas. And so what the Inclusive Communities, which is a nonprofit that brought the suit against Texas Department of Housing, was saying was basically that this is not equal opportunity. It's not allowing people of color and national origin to be living in areas of equal opportunity. So here's some other examples of disparate impact. A property management company will only consider full-time employment, calculating the income of prospective tenants. The result would be a disproportionate impact on people who receive disability payments. So it would be discrimination based, of course, on disability. A local zoning ordinance restricts housing with more than 3 bedrooms, result disparate impact on people with larger families, discrimination based on familial status. These are other policies that may have a disparate impact: source of income, criminal history, credit history, eviction records, citizenship status, and for jurisdictions, urban renewal, code enforcement, exclusionary zoning, and residency preferences. All of those have the potential for disparate impact. So what do we mean by affirmatively furthering fair housing, and where did this come from? And basically, it's removing barriers to fair housing choice and creating ways to access housing choice. And what the new AFFH ruling was trying to get to was assessing our current patterns of behavior and our past patterns of behavior to try to move forward beyond segregation and discrimination. So again, since 1968, HUD's been under an obligation to do this in its programs, and basically it's the policies are lined out in this section 808E5. It's been an existing ruling since, a HUD ruling since 1994. Broad requirements, this is the analysis of impediments, and the enforcement was episodic. So jurisdictions that received federal funds, like through Community Development Block Grant, were required to do what they call an analysis of impediments to fair housing. It was really just kind of a cursory study. There was no enforcement behind it. They basically had to look at, well, what are the impediments out there that a jurisdiction has to fair housing, and what can we do about it? So, I remember Ashland's, for example, they would say, well, we don't have enough affordable housing. That's an impediment to fair housing. But they didn't really have any measurable goals. They couldn't really, there wasn't any way to work on it. So the new ruling which started, I guess, in effect since 2013. I thought it was 2015, 2013. It is more data-driven, and it was more front-end review, and it was robust in the community participation piece. So what happens a lot with Community Development Block Grant, when decisions are made about funding, there's a lot of stuff comes through, not in the beginning, but more when it's going to council. So council, of course, makes its decisions on who gets the funding ultimately. But the new AFFH ruling was saying, let's bring in the community groups up front before we go through the whole funding process. Let's bring them in and talk about where are the needs, especially as it relates to fair housing. So that's a big part of it. So who has to do this? Any kind of groups that receive federal funds, so specifically jurisdictions like the city of Eugene, and specifically for funding programs such as CDBG or HOME or HOPWA. And public housing authorities also have to do it, and recipients of federal funds from any 22 other federal agencies that have anything to do with housing. So the Department of Transportation, the Department of Education, the military, all of those, they have anything that has to do with housing and community development has to do this affirmatively furthering fair housing. So the kinds of things that we look at under affirmatively furthering fair housing is promoting all neighborhoods in the case of Eugene, but investing equally in all your neighborhoods. It's a legal requirement, again, for jurisdictions that receive federal housing or community development dollars. And what they're saying is because federal money helped create the problem, like I said, the FHA, the VA policies, all the different things that were put in place, because that helped to create the problem, federal money has to be spent to restore it to those communities that have been impacted by housing discrimination. So on your left are all the various, what we call entitlement communities, the ones that receive funds from the feds directly. And balance of state, that they're ones that the smaller communities may apply to Oregon State to get the community development and housing funds. And so basically it's saying the idea behind this is to use these funds to erase those historic patterns and prevent future segregation. And what the AFFH process was doing, and they call it an assessment of fair housing now, it's looking at those elements of segregation and integration and identifying areas that had concentrations of poverty, race, and national origin. And we didn't really have a lot of concentration of poverty or national origin here in Oregon, not like they do back in the Midwest and so on. But mainly it's looking at creating those access to those areas of opportunity so that people all have a right to have opportunity, schools and parks and libraries and whatever. And looking at infrastructure investments and ensuring, again, that robust participation and ensuring that happens up front. So the AFFH rule is about fair housing planning, and that's the assessment of fair housing. And looking back to see what worked, what hasn't worked. And now and we'll talk about that, I think. Here I've got something. HUD's role was to provide data, and they put together this pretty awesome mapping tool. And it showed where segregation was occurring in your community. It showed where your affordable housing was. What else did it have, Teresa? It had a lot of different pieces on it. And you guys have a lot of that because of the work that you already had done with, what is the thing that Stephanie did?
The consolidated plan.
No,
Through lane livability.
Oh,
that lane livability, you had a lot of the data already, but a lot of communities did not have that. And so HUD, this mapping tool was really wonderful because it showed where your housing was, where it wasn't, where your affordable housing was, so you could see where it was concentrated, and then also the disparities in access to opportunity and so on. What happened is that HUD decided to postpone the implementation of that in January of this year. So, they are now, the National Fair Housing Association and a bunch of different nonprofits are in litigation over this suspension because they just decided, let's just do it. There was no public comment. They're in the process now of taking public comment up until October 15th. And they have what they call the ANPR, and I can't remember what that stands for. But you go online and you make your comments about the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And what HUD was saying is it's too difficult for these communities to do this. It requires a lot of technical assistance and we don't have it. It's burdensome. And they took down the mapping tool almost immediately. And the mapping tool, so it's no longer up there, which is really unfortunate because it was amazing. And so I think the problem was it was showing areas of segregation and showing what actually was going on. And I don't think certain people kind of like that. So it's gone right now, but now they are going through the motions with this public comment period after the fact. They stopped it and now they're going through the motions. Only one jurisdiction in Oregon has completed their assessment of fair housing, and that was Clackamas County. And theirs was approved. It was fine. I sat in on that process. It was a wonderful process. It was data-driven. They made incredible measurements, measurable objectives. That's the other thing with this assessment of fair housing. Unlike the analysis of impediments, there were actually measurable outcomes, and you work, and it's tied to the consolidated plan. And the goal was also to tie it to any kind of planning documents like the comprehensive plan. It was supposed to be a way to bring everything together. And it was, I think, wonderful because also that robust community participation was in there. And so people were getting more involved in the planning department, the whole overall planning of everything up front. So at this point, like I said, it's in suspension. Where were you guys? In terms of the
We're planning to do one next year.
Are you going to try to do an assessment of fair housing?
I'm not sure.
So certain communities are going to try to go ahead and do a complete assessment of fair housing. The main factor for most jurisdictions, I know like Washington County was interested, Bend is in the process. They did this survey. They did a survey of their citizens and they had 900 comments back, which is just amazing to me. I mean, on what kind of discrimination was happening in Bend. So they're going to do kind of a mixture of the old analysis of impediments and the assessment of fair housing piece. So a lot of communities they're sitting on the fence waiting to know what's going to happen with this. And it's really unfortunate because it was, I think, would have been a very useful document for jurisdictions. So.
Louise, I looked it up. The ANPR is the Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking.
There you go. Thank you. And they have it, it's interesting, they want you to comment online and they give you it's incredible, 7 different questions and you have to kind of respond to each one. And it's really talking more about how this is so burdensome, is this burdensome and how can you do this? But it's a useful thing to do. If you want to get online and take a look at it and make any comments, that would be great. So here are some indicators of barriers to equal opportunity, that we were looking at and what the assessment of fair housing actually was looking at education and the basis of the free lunch programs and graduation rates and those kinds of things, looking at economic development, land use policies and zoning decisions, incentives for mixed use and affordable housing and affirmative marketing, economic health in the neighborhood, looking at deserts, food deserts, looking at grocery stores and job opportunities and publicly funded economic development and infrastructure investments. And accessibility of housing, making sure that you have housing near transportation and services, it's barrier-free, it meets design and construction standards, and also looking at location, availability, and accessibility, unit sizes, accessible features, environmental features, and special consideration to group homes and mixed income and first-time home buyer, looking at, again, the public transportation and LIDs and environmental issues. So fair housing law, here's where we get to what you guys care about, is the land use laws. It prohibits land use regulations and restrictive covenants and conditional or special use permits that may limit housing choice based on protected class. And I gave you some copies. We put together this really wonderful booklet. It's called Finding Common Ground, Inclusive Communities Toolkit. And there's 3 guides in it. And it's online, you guys can see it online, but these booklets, you've got the code pieces. These are like a guide for elected officials and for staff and public, planning people, and guide for housing providers, and then we have a guide for neighborhoods. So these talk about what you can and can't do to stay out of fair housing trouble. And some of the things that we found were common mistakes were requiring projects to undergo additional approval steps, hearings, or meetings with neighbors that were not required of for other housing projects. This is primarily affordable housing, but it's also group homes, those kinds of things, boarding homes, all of that. We say often that fair housing isn't necessarily affordable housing, and affordable housing isn't necessarily fair housing, but there is a nexus. The connection is the types of people that live in affordable housing are definitely members of protected class, national origin, color, race, also single moms with children and people with disabilities. So all of those people are impacted by affordable housing, of course. Requiring projects to have extra screening or setbacks or other design modifications that you don't require for other kinds of housing projects. Requiring burdensome public safety requirements. This was an issue when I went down. There was a housing authority project in Grants Pass, and they wanted them to put in a lot more public safety kinds of things and even pay for possibly extra police. So, interfering with funding by withholding or delaying certifications or other documentation that the developer needs, treating group homes in a neighborhood zone for single-family units differently from other housing for unrelated people living together in a single unit, imposing dispersion or spacing requirements for housing with people with disabilities. So here's a couple of cases that shows you what can go on with land use issues in fair housing. This was one in Sussex County and in Delaware. And what happened is the county rejected an application for 50 single-family homes for predominantly Black and Hispanic low-income persons. And the Department of Justice sued the county for zoning law violation, and the developer received $750,000, and the subdivision plan was approved in a high-opportunity neighborhood. This one's Joliet. The city wanted to remove a predominantly minority multifamily property by eminent domain, and HUD intervened to try to stop the seizure, and DOJ filed a lawsuit against the city claiming that it was discriminatory based on race. And Joliet's analysis of impediments to fair housing was rejected, and thus their consolidated plan was rejected. This is really unusual. Normally, they don't reject these kinds of things. And they went all the way with this one, and Joliet didn't receive HUD funding in 2011 and 2012. So what was happening is we were seeing increased enforcement under the Obama administration, and they were starting to really enforce this, the kinds of land use decisions that were impacting housing. So this was the seminal case. You all probably have heard about the one in Westchester County. And there was a claim that they falsely certified that they had complied. There's a certification form on when you sign your CDBG form, you certify that you will affirmatively further fair housing. And for years, the mayor had just signed that, and most mayors just do. They just sign it, but they claimed it, and they got them on the False Claims Act, basically. And in 2009, there was a consent decree that allocated $51.6 million for construction and affirmative marketing of 750 units in 31 white municipalities. What was happening is that they were locating their housing in already segregated areas. And so this was saying that they had to expand and so on. And HUD's withheld more than $20 million in federal, primarily community development block grant funds since 2011. And it's still not resolved there. They're still fighting it. Michael Allen from Relman, Dane, and Koufax said that they perpetuated racial segregation by permitting wealthier, predominantly white towns and villages to impose zoning and land use policies and practices that made multifamily development impossible and effectively steered low-income housing tax credit developments to disadvantaged neighborhoods with high minority populations and diminished opportunities. So that's what I have on AFFH. I'm going to do just a quick thing, and I gave you a brochure on this. People don't realize there are actually design and construction standards related to fair housing. A lot of developers don't realize it. We've had several cases in our state. And actually at the University of Oregon, we had a training a couple years ago where we brought in a wonderful expert on this whole topic. But basically, there's specific FHA construction standards related to accessibility on multifamily dwellings with 4 or more units that have been built after March 13th, 1991. And what they say is if you are going by the International Building Code of like 2013 or above, it's substantially equivalent, so it would be included probably. But it includes these things: an accessible building entrance on an accessible route, accessible public and common use areas, usable doors, usable by a person in a wheelchair, accessible route into and through the unit, light switches and electrical outlets and thermostats and other environmental controls in accessible locations, reinforced walls. They don't have to have the grab bars, but reinforced to put them in later, and usable kitchens and bathrooms. We did a number of testing in a lot of new buildings here in Eugene and in Portland. We had a couple complaints here in Eugene, and I know I had to go out and take my little tape measure and measure the slope and so on. It was okay. But there's been a couple in Portland where brand new buildings where they just don't have these things, and they hadn't thought about these kinds of things. So basically what we're doing is we want to challenge the assumptions and standards so far and look at our decision-making process, making sure that we have robust input, that good community participation from a broad spectrum of impacted populations, right? And looking at what the data tells us, what's the legitimate business reason? If you have a specific rule or policy or practice, is there a reason for it that you can substantiate? What are the barriers created by our current process or rule? Is there a less discriminatory way to accomplish our goals? And can or should we add additional protected classes locally? So those are all the kinds of things to think about when you're making decisions here. So equalizing opportunity, know your fair housing protected classes, and you do address NIMBY attitudes. And I think this booklet for neighbors is pretty good about that, because it tells, you know, what they can and can't really do, that they can't just come in and say, we don't like it, and they will anyway. But market first-time home buyer programs to diverse communities, consider location and availability of your affordable housing, and promote housing that's structurally accessible to people with disabilities. Address issues related to zoning for residential care facilities. That's a whole nother area. Consider location of key infrastructure, ensure that land use policies encourage diversity, offer incentives for mixed use and affordable housing, promote public transportation routes in all neighborhoods, ensure economic development and housing opportunities are related to transit lines, and ensure that public infrastructure is connected to low-income housing in diverse communities. Consider access to employment, foster access to grocery stores in low-income neighborhoods, and review your codes. So there's two code things that I've given you here that we've developed. One is the guide for examining local land use with a fair housing lens, and the other one is a guide for developing accessible and age-friendly zoning code. And I put that it's on our website. You can get a copy, but there's copies here that go into best practices and so on. So we also talk about Goal 10, and I think you guys have probably received a letter from us. So we have this project that deals with the PAPAs, the plan proposed, I can never remember, plan acknowledgement, proposed amendment, plan acknowledgement. Anyway, the PAPAs, when you make a change in your zoning or your comp plan, you have to send it to DLCD. And so when DLCD gets it, we get a list of what they're reviewing. And so there was a whole bunch of stuff on the ADU stuff, because everybody was dealing with that in the state. So we had to address that and look at that whole thing. But we mainly are concerned with Goal 10 and making sure that when you're making your land use decisions, that when you're dealing with any kind of residential, that your staff is making sure they're relating it back to the building land inventory and to the housing needs analysis to show that you're looking at what the housing units, the types. And the Goal 10, this is what it is. Building lands for residential use shall be inventoried, and plans shall encourage the availability of adequate numbers of needed housing units at price ranges and rent levels which are commensurate with the financial capabilities of Oregon households, and allow for flexibility of any housing location, type, and density. So with this project that we've been looking at, we are in our third or fourth year now. We're partners with housing land advocates, and I've got a bunch of folks that are retired planners. I've got 1,000 Friends of Oregon is involved with it, and the housing land advocate folks, Ed Sullivan, who's a former land use attorney, a lot of retired, really good land use attorneys and planners that are on this. And what they do is they take a look at the PAPAs as they come through and really look and see if it's complying with Goal 10, if they've actually gone through and made sure that everything is taking place the way it should. And then we get back and say, wait a minute, really you should take a look at this and make sure you're meeting your Goal 10 requirements and so on. And that's one area. The other, we also see red flags. We don't see many now because everyone is they know we need affordable housing. So they're not doing things like taking land out of single family zoning or taking land out of multifamily and putting it into single family. In the beginning, we were seeing some of that, and that's a red flag for us. So, post-acknowledgement plan amendments, there it is, okay. So they address Goal 10, refer to housing needs assessment and building lands inventories, and what we do is we also watch out for potential fair housing violations. So I just received one today from a coastal town that's looking at putting in, I think it was dormitory style housing for workers of a specific company down there. And they were looking at preferences, and that's another area that's huge, is this whole area of preferences. And because of disparate impact, there's a potential for preferences to be discriminatory. So we always want to take a close look at those kinds of things as well. So what you can do here is to make sure fair housing materials are available, and I know Teresa and Stephanie make sure that there's brochures around and so on. Educate your citizens, educate your city housing providers and real estate agents and lenders, and we're doing all that. So, and reserve, we have a great display. You guys, have you had that down here?
Not in the last 2 years.
We should bring it down. It would be great out in the atrium. It's a 7-panel, they're big panels, and shows the history of discrimination in Oregon. It's really amazing. It's very well done. So it'd be a good thing to have. And contact us. As Teresa was saying, we have a hotline, and it's, the best way to reach us is information@fhco.org, because we have a very small staff. And our hotline is only personed a couple days a week, and they don't return your calls. They can't. They can only, got to catch them while they're there. And so what I tell people is if you have a question or an issue, do information@FHCO, and they'll direct it to the right staff, and we'll get back to you. So, any questions? I'm sure. Let me turn the lights on.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
That was great. So commissioners, do you have questions?
I do.
Commissioner Borowski?
I've got several. So one of the things that I've always wondered about is communities or apartments that are 55 and older.
There's an exemption.
Okay.
55 is, we have to be careful with those. They have to recertify every couple years. And the 62 plus, they're built that way, they're constructed that way, and so there's not a problem with them. But the 55 plus, I have done innumerable settlement trainings with 55 plus communities that thought they were 55 plus communities and weren't really. So, but they have to have at least one person that's 55 and over in each household. And you can't steer, you can't artificially create it. It has to kind of come on its own, and then they have to maintain it. And it's hard to do.
I always wondered about that one.
Yeah. You know why they put that in? I found that out the other day. Remember I told you families with children was protected?
Yeah.
That was the bone for the seniors at that point. They created that exemption for the seniors when they brought in the families with children protected class.
Okay. Okay.
So,
The other one that jumped out, well, there's two more questions that I have. One is, you mentioned a limit on bedrooms. And
For that disparate
it
impact
seems to me that in our minor code amendments, didn't we limit bedrooms in the university areas to no more than 3 bedrooms on new builds?
I think I'd have to look. That might be related to ADUs specifically, and that might have been part of the interim protection measures that happened.
We might want to look at that and see if we did do that. And then my third question goes to emerging technologies. And it's not so much the long-term rental things, but has there been any action on short-term rentals and discrimination on some of the platforms that are out there that, in my opinion, are very easy to discriminate?
there've been some cases. They've been handling it primarily through, I think, Department of Justice, because it's public accommodations, because they're not considered dwellings under the Fair Housing Act.
Okay.
But I'm wondering if they're gonna change that, because there's been so many problems. I don't know, I don't know where that's gonna go. But right now, yeah, there's been discrimination, and they've dealt with it in terms of the public accommodations, kind of like motels and hotels.
Right, exactly. I mean, with the new platforms.
It's such a strange, and it's hard, and it's really difficult, as you know, in our state, because it's taken rentals out of production. I mean, they're all on the coast and Hood River and Bend. I mean, they're just really having a hard time because they're all going into vacation rentals and Airbnb, and they lose all that rental housing, and a lot of seniors and a lot of people with disabilities and that have been in those rentals for years and years are left out.
Okay.
So we have been looking at that, trying to figure out what our role is going to be in terms of, and actually we've seen some really good some good stuff that jurisdictions have done. Hood River in particular had some really good information on that and how to deal with it. They limited the number and so on.
Right, I mean, because there's different types of, there's discrimination on race and those types of things, but there's also ADA accessibility
Right.
type of situations
Exactly.
that are not being addressed. And I'm just wondering if that could fall under fair housing, or if it has to go through the other channel.
The ADA. Yeah, and then there's a lot, we're looking at more roommate situations too, which there's some differences there too, because if they're living in your house and they don't have a separate entrance or something, then you can say, if you're a single woman, you can say, I only want a single woman, but you can't, you can't discriminate against color or religion or any of those things either. So there's a lot of variations that are happening because of all these, because of our affordable housing problem. It's creating a lot of other things. And this preference thing is really interesting. We're just seeing more and more of that. So.
Okay, Commissioner Edwards?
I just had one question because you just touched on it. So if somebody is wanting to, let's say I'm a single woman and I want to rent out just a room in my home, do the same criteria apply in that I wouldn't be able to, discriminate on whether it's a man or a woman or?
You can discriminate against a man if you're sharing the restroom and so on.
Yeah.
You can do that. There was a case that involved that.
Okay.
You can't discriminate against race or religion. I think you can I'm not sure on this one, of family status. I think you can though, on that, because it is your home.
Right. Okay.
But if you do take in somebody with a disability, they can come back and ask for an accommodation for an animal, an assistance animal. So, and you'd have to allow that, is my understanding. So, you know anything about that, Elliot, in terms of rooms? No, I know you know about assistance animals, but roommate stuff in terms of,
I only know that there's there's an exception for the sex discrimination.
right.
I don't.
Is
know
there for
about-
family status? I thought there was.
I doubt it, but maybe. I wouldn't know.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. I think we're gonna have to do more work on that because I think it's coming up a lot, that one, so roommates.
Yeah, Commissioner Fregla?
You mentioned in relationship to what Commissioner Borowski asked you about, I assume you're talking about like Airbnb and stuff like that. You said that there was some good things that were done in Hood River. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
No, I don't really know a whole lot. I mean, I just know that that our committee that really liked what they did there, and there was some really good stuff that came out of it in terms of how they limited the number and so on, and I guess where they, it was a thorough job. They really were thoughtful about it. If it's something that you guys are looking at here in Eugene, it would be one to look at. So, the other communities that have looked at it and done some work is Bend.
Yeah,
has done,
Bend has
Lincoln City.
an ordinance.
Yeah, there's quite a few that are.
Ben's ordinance is a restriction of vacation rentals just in general. And you have to get a permit with the city, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, Portland has it, but they're not enforcing it much. So, I don't know.
Any other questions? Commissioner Borowski, did you have another?
So the AFFH, is that, in our community here, is that basically taken care of when we submit our comp plan? I mean, that's part of our comp plan on how we are gonna achieve the goals of getting those.
It is in addition to having our contract with Fair Housing Council.
Okay.
And you're doing it tonight.
Right.
Just
Well, and
educating yourselves on this is part of the AFFH.
We do address that. There is a section, we just did the CAPER, which is the annual update,
Right.
and we address that how we affirmatively further for housing.
right. And then there's also in this community, which goes back a long way, we've got it codified that we disperse our not subsidized housing, but our low-income housing needs to be
Throughout the city.
throughout
yeah.
the city.
Yeah.
And that's been codified for years. that's.
Do you have maps? Because I know Ben just put together a set of maps to show where they're affordable. It's pretty cool where their affordable housing is.
Yeah, I'm sure we
It took
do.
a while to pull that
Yeah.
Yeah,
together,
I
but
think we do. But,
yeah,
yeah.
it's pretty neat because you can actually see that it is, you know, you can see where it's not and you can see where it is, so.
And that was work of planning commissioners back in the 70s. Betty Niven was very instrumental in putting that into the city's code and
I
getting
heard
it,
about her. yeah.
getting it diversified throughout the community. There's actually a street off of Hilliard named after her. So, there you
Yeah,
go.
she was amazing.
Any other questions, comments?
I just
Yeah,
have one last
Commissioner
question. Thank you. As I'm thinking about new development and, you know, new construction of housing, how is it that, or what's the control mechanism, I suppose, for providing affordability at different levels, knowing that, you know, if development costs are X and we have a lot of cost drivers right now, I mean, construction costs are high, labor's high, materials is really high. I would challenge anyone who thinks that they could build a new construction that is affordable below a certain level unless it is subsidized. And so I'm just curious on your thoughts of that, because I just don't know.
Well, I know they're looking at all kinds of things in the state now.
Yeah.
In terms of, you know, how do we deal with this? Because system development charges are so high and they, you know, can we waive them? Can we reduce them for affordable housing? And if so, where can we make up the money? Those kinds of things. There's a bunch of different strategies that the state is looking at and jurisdictions are looking at, but it is a huge issue. They pretty much have to subsidize. If it's 30 to 50%, or at this point, almost 80% has to be subsidized as well. So not as bad as San Francisco, but gee.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's and it's interesting because you know that I know the state's doing a whole bunch with they've got this workforce housing pilot, and they're trying a bunch of different strategies with that to try to see what will work and trying to get employers to maybe develop housing. And so they've got a couple pilots that look really interesting to me. Pacific City is doing something with the Pelican Brewery. I think Warm Springs is doing, they needed more housing for teachers, so they're renovating a bunch of housing and building more housing there, working with them. And there's one, I think, that's working with the school district. Where was that? I can't remember. There's 5 different pilot projects that they're looking at. One had to do with the reduced SDCs. So there's everybody's trying to figure out what can we do to create more affordable housing, and they're looking at everything. So
I was going to say,
Okay.
Commissioner Borowski and then Commissioner
Okay.
Edwards. Yeah.
Thank you. So you mentioned that you got to look at the ADU issue.
Yeah.
And
depth.
well, and that kind of brings me to the time, you know, the issues that come up sometimes with the tiny houses or the smaller footprint houses where we're going to run into things where if you want your bedroom to be a loft, you're going to be in violation of a lot of these things because that house would be discriminatory. You can't climb, you know, somebody with a disability isn't going to be able to climb up into a loft. So is there?
You're bringing out the difficult ones.
Well,
We actually,
I'm sorry, but
No, but
you know,
this
that-
is exactly what we're trying to deal with, the tiny house communities that are for homeless. We had a HUD grant this past year to train homeless shelters in terms of fair housing, because they're mostly considered dwellings, and they have to comply with fair housing. And if you think that single-family housing is, I mean, just all the things they have to deal with in terms of making sure they're not discriminating and so on. But we ran into issues with the tiny house. There's the one in Kenton, and you guys have them here too, where some of them don't have any electricity or running water. And some of them are only for single women, and you really couldn't put a family in there at all. And so we're trying to figure out, well, where do we come down? I mean, where do we come down on all this? Because there are potential for fair housing violations with this, so. But no, it has not been resolved, and we're still taking, I think, mostly because I don't know if it would be considered a dwelling under the fair housing laws. And that's like the first thing they define, right? Is what's a dwelling? Where do you come down on tiny houses? Have you had any issues with that, Elliot?
My name is Elliot Fair, and I'm an attorney with the Oregon Law Center, which is legal aid here in Lake County. And we don't want, I mean, in my office, we don't want to sue them and shut them down, but we do think the Oregon Residential Landlord Tenant Act applies to them. They don't follow it because it's hard to follow it.
It's hard, yeah.
So there needs to be a legislative fix, and that's far above my pay grade.
Yeah, that's my feeling too. It's-
Well, but so if it, it's above your pay grade, but it's issues that need to be brought up
Yes.
and identified so that it can be taken to the legislature and given to the pay grade people. Because if we don't bring it up at these levels where we're on the ground and trying to build these types of units and running into these barriers, the legislatures are going to write the laws, and the legislatures write a lot of times write crummy laws.
Yep.
Okay, and so if we can identify these barriers and a way to do it, and then move it up the chain so that the good legislation gets written, I think that's, otherwise we just sit around and say, no, you can't build that because it's got a loft, and that's a cop out in my opinion. So
I agree. We need to work on this.
Okay.
This is on the docket.
Okay,
This
good.
and preferences and
good.
vacation rentals.
So I have two, I have Commissioner Edwards and then Commissioner Randall.
My question is, are there any funding sources for renovations versus having to, you see a lot of homes that are kind of dilapidated and that are, most people would say, well, this, it's a tear down and then it displaces a family or whatnot because, and I know in experience, and I've encountered people who don't have the financial means to fix their rentals for their tenants. I mean, they would if they could, but they have nowhere to, other than raising rent.
Right.
They can't, they don't have the financial means. And so they end up, not being able to provide adequate housing for those people.
We do have a program using CDBG funds
Okay.
for owners if the tenant is low, moderate income, or extremely low income.
Okay.
And so we have guidelines, and I can give you information on that.
Okay.
But they're small grants. They've just been expanded from $5,000 to $10,000, but it's emergency minor home repair.
Yeah.
And then also accessibility improvement plan. So if someone has a disability and they need a ramp in their home or some other kind of modification, again, if the tenant or the homeowner, if they don't have a tenant, is a very low income, it's limited that way.
Thank you.
Commissioner Randall.
Well, and kind of to tag on to what Commissioner Borowski was talking about on the tiny houses and that, I think the distinction that they're making, at least at the state level, is between what you were mentioning is, houses without power and water. Those are generally on wheels, and they're classified right now, I think, under the RV codes for the state as recreational vehicles. And that's different than the tiny houses, which is just recently added to the code for the building code, where they are on foundations, have water, electricity, and those sorts of things. And so I think that's the distinction, at least right now, where that's at. It still doesn't solve all of the problems, but at least it makes that distinction between some of those considered temporary housing and a more permanent structure.
So in the city of Eugene, the units on wheels are under a different ordinance. It's a temporary sleeping, I forget the actual title of it, camping and sleeping ordinance. So there isn't necessarily right now, there's not an end to that timeline. So you can actually cite, as long as all of the hookups, et cetera, are temporary, if there are those facilities, you can hook them up temporarily, and there are guidelines around it. The dimensions are very specific, so you don't need a commercial license to actually drive on the freeway, so they have to be, meet the RV standards, trailer standards for width and length, et cetera. And they can be sited on properties, as long as the use allows it. Yeah, Commissioner.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the HUD budget has been stable or has it been decreasing under the,
Under the current administration.
right?
It's been, well, CDBG has been decreasing exponentially, which is unfortunate, because that's where most of our low-income housing money comes from. But for fair housing, so far, we don't know yet. We're waiting for the NOFA this year to come out, and I don't know where it is at this point. We have not seen an impact yet, but we're worried that we're next. So, yeah.
You said that CDBG, what size of, is it like a 5% reduction or is it quite much more substantial?
CDBG, actually, the last 2 to 3 years has been fairly stable, right, coming in right around $1 million a year. But historically, it was much larger. There was a big dip in the late 2000s, like 2008, and it dipped down. But the last few years, it's been steady about there.
Part of it has to do with when new entitlement communities come on board, then that kind of, they spread the same amount of money over. So we ended up with some new entitlement communities like Bend and Hillsborough and groups like the Albany. Those are all rather new. Grants Pass, all new in the last couple of years, so, yeah. So we're all competing for that same amount of money, all the jurisdictions. I know Portland's went way down. So.
Commissioner Baker.
And is that still a primary funding for lower income housing?
That and home, which is usually connected to it. Yeah, and then the public housing authorities, their budgets have been really hit hard. And that's, I think, the main affordable housing in the country is there. But yeah, they've been hit hard.
Well, if there are no more questions, you want to?
Yeah, I was just gonna encourage commissioners, if you have any thoughts about upcoming projects that are on the docket. It's a great opportunity to have Louise here to throw out any future questions, if you have any. Otherwise, we're in touch.
If you get a letter from us, then
Yeah.
What other groups are you presenting to in this round?
I've just presented to Bend recently.
No, I mean in Eugene. Is this this year's outreach?
This is the first one of this year. We have 5 other ones.
Okay.
Planned, including one to realtors, one to Lane Equity Consortium.
We do a landlord one.
We do one for affordable housing providers.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, great.
yeah.
And I believe other boards and commissions were invited to this one tonight. We also let everybody know that they can watch it online, and this is recorded. And it's, not only broadcast, but it's archived on the website, so people can watch it anytime.
Excellent.
Thank you for your excellent questions.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here, Louise.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And be in touch. Sorry about the technical difficulties earlier.
It's fascinating to see that little projector.
Yeah.
Yeah, new technology. Pretty soon it'll come out of your,
You can have them. They
Right
make
out
ones
of your
that can
phone, yeah.
yeah.
come onto your phone.
So before we segue to the next topic, I think it would be great for us to get that historical presentation in the
display?
Yeah, the display. So
I agree.
If that's possible. Yeah, it'd be great.
It's really good. We have 2 of them now, so they're, so we get them out more often, so.
Yeah,
This is a really great space for it. We do that all the time.
Yeah.
that or the library.
Yeah, that or the library.
Library.
Or both. You could
Yeah.
You could
Put it-
put, yeah,
a week or two in one and a week or two in the other.
Yeah, that's great.
this is a good time of year.
Yeah.
I'm sending it down to Klamath Falls, one of them this week, and one's going to Beaverton, but after that, it'll be available, so.
Yeah, we have a lot of land use decisions in, you know, the next few years, so I think just that awareness, especially around ADUs, clear and objective housing, I mean, that's amazing. Clear and objective standards, sorry, I didn't mean fair housing is the other one, I blended them.
Too much.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you, yeah. Okay, Robin, you want,
Yeah, last item?
yeah, last item?
Okay.
Yeah.
So, let's see here. Sorry, I was distracted briefly. Sorry?
I just wondered what they were looking at.
Oh, yeah, I think they're looking at us. Who are those people? What are they doing? So I sent out an email late last week that talked about a potential agenda for the joint meeting with City Council. And your chair, Kristen, and I just had a conversation with Mayor just before this meeting to talk about what her interest was in the meeting. And I think we have a good handle on that, but I wanted to throw it out there and get feedback from you all too, and just talk a little bit about, since this is the last time we'll be meeting together before the joint meeting, just talk a little bit about how that'll work. So in the email, I think where we landed in conversation with the mayor is probably pretty close to what we were thinking initially. So because there's 90 minutes, which is a whole work session, and it seems like a lot of time, but it's really not when you have what boils down to, well, I guess it'll be 15 people if Tiffany's not going to be there. So 15 people still means that we'll have to, I think the mayor said that everybody will get 2 minutes and wants to hear from everybody and do at least 2 rounds of questions. And we'll start off, though, first with introductions for the Planning Commission members and just say a little bit about who you are and how long you've been on the Planning Commission and like what your vocation is normally. I think is what we boiled down to. And then I'll do a brief presentation. I'll try to keep it under 10 minutes and talk a little bit about the roles and responsibilities of the Planning Commission, how the Planning Commission was created and why, the kind of work that you do, a few statistics about how many meetings you have. Looking like I calculated, I think there's about 1,000 volunteer hours every year that the commission as a whole invests on behalf of the community. And talk a little bit about what the relationship is to council. So the kinds of work that you do, obviously the quasi-judicial role, and then the legislative role, and how that, just try to lay it out really clearly how that works. And then maybe have a couple hypothetical examples. And then following that, we'll just segue right into a discussion. And the mayor will facilitate, of course. And she will, I think, ask for a round of comments from council and commissioners. And the first round would be something along the lines of what challenges do you foresee in preparing important upcoming recommendations for council? And that'll provide ample opportunity for anyone to bring up whatever concerns or challenges that we've been talking about for the last couple of years, and also from the perspective of counselors. And then to make sure that we really land on a kind of proactive, forward-thinking footing. And that's the feedback that I've heard from all of you and then discussions over years that we've had about this. So, the second round of questions would be something like, what ideas do you have for providing the best possible support to council in making important decisions? And that can be ideas for what Planning Commission could do or what council could do. And then go from there. So if there's time left over, you know, there may be some questions or back and forth, who knows? So that should be plenty of time for everyone to speak and respond. Any thoughts or questions or ideas or concerns about that as an agenda? Does it?
Commissioner Borowski?
Yeah.
No, I think that that's a great idea. It may be advantageous for us to flush out some of those at this meeting here so that we're not having the same commissioner saying, this is the challenge I see, and then the next person says this, and it's the same challenge. And so we make sure that we get our top 3 or 4, again, it's limited time, and ideas for best support. I don't know, because that's something, you know, if you wait to do it and we make our little notes, Commissioner Randall goes first, and then it's like, oh, that's what I was gonna say. I would rather have us make sure that the topics that are important to us here, maybe we flesh those out a little bit, either now or between them, so that they get brought up, and then we can move on to another topic that may be important to us. Just throwing that out there.
Commissioner Baker?
Well, I was wondering too, I mean, there's 2 ways to think of it, in looking at it both ways. You know, what concerns we have, but also what concerns the city council has and how we could be more helpful or whatever in answering, you know, in dealing with their, you know, the issues that are land use related that they would like for us to focus on.
So Commissioner Baker, that actually, in Robin's intro, that's actually the focus of the meeting. So when they say challenges, because we are really in service to the city and the city council, so that actually is the objective. And then obviously we can talk about those challenges, but really as volunteers, we want to be as effective as possible in this process structure that we have. Yeah.
No, I'm just saying that they might have comment, I mean, we have comments to them, but they might have questions, to, you know, or comments to us that.
Yeah,
they
we assume
will.
that they will, that's for sure.
So everybody gets to have 2
Yeah,
minutes, so it's not
counselors
just
and,
us.
and planning commissioners,
Yeah.
apologies, will have the opportunity to respond, yeah.
But you do bring up a good question, which was identified, actually, the mayor was doing the math, that's really interesting. So let's say all of us actually had questions instead of comments. We don't have a lot of extra time to be having a dialogue where there's answering questions. So it'll be, you know, it might need to be individual follow-ups to each, you know, the council separately and the commission separately, but that's something we'll have to kind of address when we're there and see what kind of comes up. Yeah. Yeah, Commissioner Fragala.
So is this something that happens annually? Okay, that answers part of it. Is this happening because of concerns from somewhere? I mean, I'm new to the game, so I'm just going to put it out there.
Well, I'll just respond from my observations over the last few years. Planning Commission has been talking about connecting with council in a more sort of direct, personal, kind of trust-building way for several years. I'm going to say maybe 3 to 4 years we've been talking about it in earnest, and longer than that in terms of just saying, hey, there's a lot of important work happening here. Let's rebuild that connection. I think at some point in the past, there were more regular meetings between the City Council and Planning Commission. They hadn't happened for many years. So in a sense, it's rebuilding that relationship.
Step in that direction.
Exactly. And I don't think there's an expectation that everything is going to be completely changed in one meeting. But if that's an interest of yours, and I know at least the mayor expressed interest in doing that, you should bring it up.
Yeah, I don't know, Commissioner Randall, were you here when there was still the buddy system, or was that right before your time?
No, I was here during the buddy system, but it never happened.
So there's been efforts
on my end.
historically. Yeah, yeah.
The counselor that I had, actually, we've had more conversations since they are no longer on the council than when they were, so.
Yeah.
So at least that's a positive out of that. But yeah, the buddy system didn't really work.
Yeah. Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I was going to say, there was a period of time where we did meet with the council, in the past. And to explain the buddy system, sort of, we were each assigned a counselor that was sort of our liaison to the council and their liaison to the planning commission theoretically. So.
Theoretically.
And it had worked in the past. It's not like it never worked, but.
Commissioner Fragola.
It seems like, no, I know the Human Rights Commission has a city council member who is a liaison to the Human Rights Commission, but we don't have anything like that. And I was wondering if it's because we make quasi-judicial decisions?
That's correct. It's because of the unique construction of the Planning Commission and how it's enabled through state statute and the city ordinance, or the city code, yeah.
Okay.
Commissioner Edwards?
That was my question, and it was
Okay.
answered. Thank
All right.
you.
Commissioner Borowski?
So I'm just going to throw out a few things that I would like to throw out at the table if city councils were sitting there. So one of them is the challenges that we have as planning commissioners, and I think Commissioner Taylor brings this up very articulately. The fact that we're not elected, we're appointed, and we're appointed citywide. And we have to look at the community as a whole and not as wards. And so sometimes that, to me, when it moves up the chain and the commissioners are looking at a recommendation that we may have, and then they look at it through the lens of their constituents who are calling them and saying, this affects my ward in a certain way, and I don't like it, so change it. And we are looking at things as the city as a whole and making recommendations on that. So letting them know that we're looking at the land use codes and amendments and our job of advising them is on a citywide thing. And we have the freedom and ability of not having to be accountable to an electorate, to be able to, the freedom to look at it that way. And I think it's important that they know that that's why some of the decisions that we may recommend may not be the best looking thing for their ward, but in our opinion, it's the best looking thing for the city. And if we could convey that, I think that would be something that I would like to see brought up.
So what's great is Robin's going to provide the introduction.
Yeah.
Because if you think about our role, which I think might be some of the confusion too, is that our at-large position is actually coming directly from City Council. So they're the ones that are adopting the comp plan, the land use code amendments, right? So these various larger decisions, at-large decisions, we're basically then the body that's ensuring or reviewing relative to policies, land use code, et cetera. It's actually coming from City Council, from those votes. Do you want to elaborate? I mean, it's going to be, I think it's going to be a helpful introduction, just what our role is and what that cycle there'll be a case study, a make-up case study of what that relationship and what that process looks like and how we fit in and that role that we serve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you nailed it. I just made a note of that. That's similar to a conversation we had earlier this afternoon. Yeah, because the Planning Commission is accountable to the direction of the City Council, our adopted policies, and our adopted regulations, in addition to other state and federal regulations. So it's different from being the system of accountability is different. Mm-hmm. That's right.
Commissioner Baker. Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, and I was also going to say, one of the issues is we have to follow the legal language in the code. You know, sometimes even if we don't think it's the best, or maybe we consider it has some negative impacts, but we're by our charge we're forced to base our decisions based on our current code.
Yeah, I second that. I think that comes to us, again, we all see it when we have an appeal. You look at something and you just say, gosh, I would love to weigh in this way, but the statute and the code says this, this, and this, and sometimes it goes against common sense, but we are kind of bound by that. Getting that across to them is tough, and the neighbors, that's, getting that from the neighborhood is very hard.
Does anybody else have any ideas or thoughts that they might bring up? Commissioner Baker.
Well, I think one of the challenges is trying to balance concerns from neighborhoods to make sure we have stable neighborhoods that, there aren't, at the same time that we're trying to develop, we're developing changes that might have an impact in those communities. We're trying to increase housing in the community, and there's some, there's a balance there, and it's a challenge to sort of meet that balance.
Yeah, Commissioner Edwards.
I just was going to mention, I find that to be a recurring theme in a lot of the things I'm personally involved in, and I think that would be a topic worth discussing. Unfortunately, I won't be there, but I would love to, be able to maybe kind of vet that, the neighborhood component in our planning process and in the process to achieving our goals, and just try to figure out, how we might need to examine that, or I don't know. I mean, it's that thing that everyone's kind of just, well, it sort of is the way it is, but I don't know that it's necessarily functioning as effectively as it could be. And I'm not suggesting that we, take away power from neighborhoods. I'm just suggesting that I think that there's a lack of representation by actual neighborhoods and neighbors and people actually living in those neighborhoods. And I would just like to get their thoughts. I meet with counselors regularly in my professional role, and it's a shared concern, and I just kind of feel like maybe we should all be talking about this.
It's in our charter. You can be head of that subcommittee, ours. Yeah. I'm serious, actually, is that's the other subcommittee now that Bree who is leading that, and Commissioner Randall and Commissioner Baker were on that. And I think with a lot of what's in front of us, kind of readdressing public involvement.
So just a clarification, technically, the whole planning commission is the Committee for Citizen Engagement, and it's designated officially. It's actually in Chapter 2 of the Land Use Code. And I think it was in 2004 that the City Council designated the Planning Commission as that committee, and actually looked into, just kind of read a little more carefully through Goal 1 and how that's enabled. And there is actually an explicit call out in Goal 1 that says, you can designate your planning commission to serve this function.
Right.
But if the body itself, meaning the city council, wanted to have to take that function on itself, they actually then have to explain to DLCD why they want to do that, and then send a letter that talks about that. But I don't believe that that's related to how the designating the planning commission for that function.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did is similar to some of the other work groups or subcommittees, is just to spend more focused time. So then that subcommittee would come back to the larger planning commission for review, approval, brainstorming, et cetera.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Commissioner.
I had one in thinking about these challenges, and I've actually had some conversations with council members about this, is that, we're kind of tasked with processing and evaluating and thinking about a lot of really technical informations. And by the time it gets to a recommendation to the city council, they may not necessarily have the same amount of time to look at all of that information, right? So we're the group that's supposed to be getting the reports over months and synthesizing this information and then sending it forward. And somehow it seems like, the amount of work that we're doing, there's a little bit of a disconnect to me in how it gets communicated, possibly. I mean, I haven't actually been part of a recommendation yet, so, this is all new to me, but it sounds like they have a tremendous amount on their plate, and then if they get a recommendation that has a lot of technical information, a lot of background information, how do we support them in making sure that they're brought up to speed on it all?
So I'm gonna throw something I would love to see happen, and I'm not sure what that would look like, that supports exactly what you're talking about, Commissioner Freilas. So I think what happens, we've got this process where we have opportunity for public input
Right.
and involvement while we're going through that detailed evaluation over sometimes years, where drafts are presented. And that's an opportunity for Planning Commission to actually make decisions at weighing feedback. So I would love to see more people present during that process, because I think what happens is then we have a hearing, and then obviously if somebody doesn't like the decision that we've made, or some people might just wait strategically to then go in front of city council. So I think one of the things that could be helpful in this process is city council really encouraging, if the public's coming to speak on behalf of certain topic areas, if there was enough coordination to know what was in front of us, to be able to encourage people to come to Planning Commission, because I know that there was some good, effective outreach during a couple of the processes where neighbors were showing up. And it's our opportunity to actually make reflective changes then, or understanding, not at the hearing, but even before, when we're doing the reviews, like the bike code. It's come before us twice, and nobody from the public was here. And it's a great opportunity. It's just hard to get people here in those preliminary stages. So I don't know how we can achieve that, and I don't know if they're going in front of city council, but I do think it could potentially help prevent, or maybe have that voice, so that people didn't show up necessarily at council, and then that discussion is started over again, and council's sitting in front of exactly what we sat in front of, but not very much time, hardly any time. Yeah, Commissioner Borowski.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example. The city council doesn't want to sit in front of that bike parking presentation. They want us to, I would hope they would want us to look through that and dig into it and make a recommendation to them. However, I also think that with the number of projects and plans that they're going to be seeing in the next year to 2 years, there's a couple of things that I would hope to get from them. And this goes back to a learning process from what we learned from South Willamette, okay? And the way that the South Willamette worked was one, and not only South Willamette, but South Willamette and Envision Eugene, because there's a couple of things. We talked about there's pillars that are in contrast with each other. The pillar that says enhance the neighborhood, enhance and protect the neighborhoods, and the pillar that says, densify and do these types of things. So there's inherent conflicts within our overall goals. So for me, a couple of things would be helpful from city council. In some of these big decisions that are going forward, if they would make the motion, we've talked about this, make the motion, we've come to a milestone, this is the direction we want to go, let's make a vote on it, not just head nods, so that we can go back and say, we're moving on from that decision, whether it's the housing mix numbers or the population numbers. Let's have that there, not just a head nod, so that when we go through and do 9 months worth of analysis on the direction that was given at a head nod, and then it comes back 9 months later and they say, I'm sorry, we want to change that. At least we can go back and say, you've given us direction to go forward. And then the other thing, as far as when we do our analysis and present it to city council, and there's issues that either people hold on to and bring up to the city councilors, let them know that it's okay to refer that back to us. Say, rather than trying to legislate that in a 45-minute work session and put things into code that somebody has written for them, or that an advocate has gotten 5 votes for, it's okay to refer things back if they've got issues with a recommendation that we made, and say, look at this again, and bring it back to us. Because I don't think that that's happened, but I think that's absolutely appropriate. So,
Commissioner Randall?
As we've been talking, I've been thinking about the whole liaison aspect, and it was mentioned that we don't have a council liaison because of the quasi-judicial nature of some of the stuff that we do, but yet it seems like the issues when they get to council often are the legislative ones and not the quasi-judicial. And so I'm wondering if we couldn't still have a council liaison that could come, especially during those legislative times and the work sessions and that, because then I think that would be a better bridge of that communication to council from us, to be able to have a counselor that's here saying, yeah, I was at that meeting and this is the tone of what was suggested, because there shouldn't be any issue with a legislative action. It's really just the quasi-judicial that could put them in an awkward place. So I think that would be something I would suggest.
Clarification, are you talking about like an ex officio person who would show up, obviously not in a voting capacity, but just
Right.
someone to attend a meeting and
Just
observe?
attend the meeting, to be here and
Yeah.
hear what we're struggling with as we go through all of those issues on something that's policy, legislative, those sorts of things, because that's ultimately going to come to them, and council will make that final decision, because we just make a recommendation to council. But it would be a good way for having a representative from council being able to communicate to the council at large kind of what we struggled with and what our tenor was on recommending or not recommending the direction.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I was going to say that one of the counselors is a member of the renewable energy, what's it called? The Sustainability Commission, and she comes regularly to the meetings and can bring them specific information on what's coming up or what their concerns are, and also she can take back some of their discussion. And I thought, I think that's worked out very well. And we could theoretically see if we could promote that as a concept that it might be willing to take on. And it wouldn't have to be the same person. It could rotate every 3 months or something like that. Because it is, the problem for us is these other committees that they do this on, like housing and sustainability, they meet once a month. We usually meet
2 or 3 times.
2 or 3, in years past, sometimes we were meeting 4 times a month. So excluding the quasi-judicial meetings. So it's a burden, obviously, because they are members of other committees and so forth, budget and other. But I think that would be a really great idea if that could happen in the future.
Maybe there's a way for us to intentionally maintain a relationship with whoever the liaison is and invite them when it's appropriate. Like, if they're already going to get this fair housing, if sometimes they're duplicative education, so they don't go to that meeting. Just have key legislative meetings where we're addressing things that eventually are going to go to them or would be helpful in their decision-making for other items on their agenda. Yeah, Commissioner Borowski.
And
Commissioner Baker.
just to, I mean, I think we kind of have a little bit of a shoehorn in, because on the ETAC committee, there is a city councilor that is a member of that committee, which is going to be weighing in on several things that we're going to be dealing with. Obviously, urban reserves, she'll be well-versed and on the growth monitoring. So that might be a kind of
That's great.
a little way to get them in, a little bit at a time.
Yeah. Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, this isn't directly related to our meeting, but because we've mentioned it, I just want to throw it out. One thing that, when we were talking, for example, of the bicycle parking, I don't know how we could do this, but maybe we could have sort of targeted promotion of certain meetings in certain communities. Like normally, we wouldn't have targeted the bicycle community for that meeting. We target our normal mailing list and so forth. But when we know we're having legislative discussions, even though we may not be voting on them, they're preliminary like that one or the ones before it, there may be some way that we could consider trying to promote those meetings within a community that's different than our normal mailing list, or even a special mailing to that mailing list. People in that mailing list that might be interested in a specific, issue, River Road or whatever,
Yeah, that's an outstanding thought. And typically, every project manager who's working on something is going to be connecting with, first of all, any large projects, we bring a public engagement plan to you guys. And so you know exactly how we're reaching out to folks and advertising things, and we're always open to feedback about how to improve that. But really try to build, reach out broadly, deeply, build a constituency around an individual project. And if it's someone from Public Works, like Reed coming to talk about the bike parking thing, then he would be managing the lists of people who get notice about that, and hopefully reaching out to the constituent communities for that subject. So it's a good point. There's not just one list fits all. They're all very diverse sets of stakeholders.
Commissioner Frola.
So I know we've discussed the whole liaison aspect quite a bit, but do we ever go to the city council and give updates on what's happening? I know I've seen you go and talk about some issues, but do we have we ever had something in place formally where, one of us goes and just says, hey, we want to know, we want you to know what we've been working on and thinking about, and you might be seeing this coming soon, and.
Do you want to answer?
Yeah, I'll just throw it out there. Not so much. Occasionally, like for bigger projects, we'll have usually the chair or someone show up and talk to the council and be at the table. But in terms of informally showing up at a council meeting, for example, during the public comment period, or on forum or something like that, not very often. Yeah, Commissioner Borowski's done that a few times, which is really helpful. And I think there's a willingness, I'll just put out there, there's a discussion happening right now about how to diversify the way that council gets information. Mm-hmm. So there's this kind of thinking about either a 45-minute or a 90-minute work session at council. Those are kind of the two types of, the two ways to get information. We can also send memos. We can also, like you just suggested, have a planning commissioner show up and just do a couple of minutes. And I think that's a great idea. I'm totally open to that. And I think folks who are working with council are open to those suggestions too.
And there's nothing like in the guidelines that says we can't show up and be like, hi, I'm one of the planning commissioners. You don't have to go and just be like, Jane Citizen or something like that.
So there is some information on that in the bylaws. And so it says if you're going as a member of Planning Commission and representing the commission, that there's some guidelines that you represent the views of the commission as a whole and not, your particular viewpoints on it. So, but that's doable.
So like, we've made a recommendation, so if a legislative thing is coming, we've made a recommendation. If you were part of the minority on that, it wouldn't be appropriate for you. You could go and stand up there as a citizen and not say, I'm representing the planning commission, but if you get up there and say, I'm John Borofsky and I am a member of the Eugene Planning Commission, and you have this legislative thing coming before you and I don't agree with it, that would go against our bylaws.
I completely understand
But you could get up there and say, we had delved into this and we came up with this recommendation after five different meetings, and we've gone through it, and we've gone back and forth on a bunch of issues, and the commission came forth with this recommendation, and give kind of that type of backgrounds. Those types of things are definitely appropriate, and I think would be well heard by the council.
Commissioner Baker and then Commissioner Edwards and then Commissioner.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we haven't in general, sometimes the minority position is presented in the report, but it would normally not be presented by the planning commission representative who is testifying. So at least that's been the way it's been during the period of time I've been on the planning commission. And very often it might be included in the report depending on the discussion.
Commissioner Edwards.
My question was whether or not would consider it to be appropriate if we, if there was something that came before the planning commission that we made a decision on, then when it goes to council and they do have that public hearing, that's generally when I've seen Commissioner Borofsky weigh in and just explain, this is kind of where our train of thought was on this, and this is what we've decided. And it was a rather informal procedure, but it was just, I don't know if that would be something that we could maybe consider doing as a practice, that if there is a public hearing on an item that we have already made a legislative decision on, that just letting them know, I don't know where they get, I'm sure they have a record of the items and they happen to know what the discussion was, but I think I would imagine it's pretty helpful for them to just hear a 2-minute synopsis of why we came to this conclusion.
Commissioner Randall, and then if we can keep it short, just we're almost to the end.
Sure, and I think that's where Commissioner Edwards was, and thinking about that idea of checking in with council as far as reporting to them or however we want to do that. I think rather than a memo, I think a live person coming to speak, even if it's the 2 minutes during the public part, is a lot better. I think memos can sometimes get lost in the plethora of paperwork that goes before council or even before us. And I think that person sitting there, even if it's just for 2 minutes, saying, hey, planning commission decided this, and maybe it's something that we have the chair do regularly when we have that, or rotate throughout the commission. And that, in fact, rotating might be good just to get the council to see all of us.
Yeah, exactly.
Too.
Relationship building.
So that's just a thought.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Randall in that regard, because I think the challenge is that sometimes we might have a position that disagrees with other advocates who do have a speaking role. Particularly the city manager sometimes comes in within a differing opinion than ours. And so it would be good to have a person there that would be sort of, rather than just 20 pages of report. So.
And then I'll end the meeting, just so the public can know, is then when the city council gets our recommendation, they don't just get it in paper form in the AIS. Staff does actually represent us verbally and give a description. It doesn't mean that this idea we've talked about in the past, and I think this is great. All of these ideas, just keep that in mind when we have our 2 minutes. If somebody's already said something, maybe jot down while we're listening and pick up some of the other ideas that we talked about tonight. I liked your idea, Commissioner Borowski. Yeah, because it's going to be tightly managed. Yeah, okay. Well, that ends tonight's meeting. So we'll see you, the next one is October 24th, right?
I think so.
Yep, okay, see you on October 24th.
Thank you so much, Louise and Teresa.